And it makes sense that he'd base his character on the person he knows better than anyone. It was going to be a cool story because it was going to be all about uncertainty and trying to figure out how to make a difference. It was going to be about the idealist, the young one who goes radical as soon as he finds a righteous cause. But, and this is a big but, Herman himself had already sidestepped such exuberant radicalism, which gets back to what I was saying about Herman in school. When he became aware of all the communists underfoot, I think he listened so carefully because he saw that his path was elsewhere. He learned quickly that awareness is what people need more than anything. So his story, if he ever finished it, would have been about the kid who gets in over his head. A tragedy about the kid who hasn't quite seen the big picture yet. Herman's character was going to be smart, no doubt, but a bit more rash and hasty than his creator. This kid, you'll hear it, was going to introduce Maoism to the poor people in his hometown. He was going to bring a revolution home to roost here in America. He was going to bring a revolution home to roost right here in America. First, Herman wrote himself right out of the story, and that means two things. He simply wrote enough to see where the story was headed, and he saw it could only go so far. Second, he wrote himself out of the storyline by simply making it impossible for a guy like himself to exist in the narrative. This I could have told him ahead of time and saved him some effort. I could have told him that he's far too thoughtful a guy to be the kid who firebombs a police station at the head of a neighborhood posse. The storyline was stupid, and Herman probably realized that whatever it was he would end up writing first wouldn't be quite that stupid. But what does he do instead? He writes middle-aged, apologetic, bullshit advice and leaves all his righteousness home in the closet. Do you see why I was pissed? No, he didn't take a summer off to go to some friend's summer house to write a bullshit romance novel. He didn't wait for a sabbatical to go off and write some sold-out midlife crisis book about looking back on a confusing childhood, or some book about a really crazy weekend surrounding some crazy aunt's funeral. He didn't write this stuff to get people all weepy and sentimental, trying to make sense of their mediocre lives. He wrote this stuff because he was writing it the whole time. Thoughts were flying around his head at alarming superhero speeds. He needed a place to put them. So what does the writer who wants to make a living writing do about it? So what does the writer who wants to make a living writing do about it? What Herman did. Master a form, and do it better than everyone else. Write an advice book and put your grandfather's name and picture on it. That is, if you're going to write an old sellout's book, then you better put a picture of an old sellout on the jacket. You better put a picture of an old sellout on the jacket. And if you write fiction, you'll have to be really good at lying. Herman would have written some pretty good stories if he'd put his mind to it, but that sort of explains it. It's like he's too busy keeping track of the real stuff going on around him. It's as if the real world is a little too important to be messing around with make-believe. So he wrote the advice book because he wanted cash, and the cash will probably keep coming for a while. Books like his Laws for Good Living don't get knocked off the bestseller list very easily. Notice exhibits A and B, that kindergarten advice book that was up there for a relative eternity, and that little instruction book, which didn't come off the list until Herman's little book came along and pushed it off. Herman told me before he showed me the journals that because of what he wrote, that most of what he wrote wasn't intended for publication. Well, once I'd read a little, I told him I disagreed. I told him it was obvious he was writing for other people. He said what he meant was that his stuff wasn't intended for publication because no publisher would publish something as straightforward and honest and subjective as his personal journals. No publisher, he said, would publish something by someone so young, especially if the journals were only a random collection of thoughts and observations. Well, here I am, and I guess I've won the argument. And I couldn't be happier, since I'm able to assure Herman that people like him get appreciated in this sold-out world. If they didn't, if Herman was ignored or silenced, the world might as well turn to porn and never look back. Anyway, I now think his little advice book is pretty great. It's funny that he did what he did. To me, it's just as brilliant as the things he says, but maybe not the way you think. His little advice book is not brilliant in itself, but it is good evidence of Herman's personal brilliance. He duped us. He gave us something totally clever and then didn't let us know the half of how clever it was. He knows what a sham giving advice can be. In fact, he knows what a sham giving advice usually is, especially when you're selling it. People pay the therapist a lot of money to listen to them and give them advice. Now just think of how quick you were to buy a quiet portable therapist in the shape of a little colorful book. A bunch of comforting advice you can get without having to tell someone your embarrassing problems. Now just think of how quick they were to buy a quiet portable therapist in the shape of a little colorful book. A bunch of comforting advice you can't get without having to tell someone your embarrassing problems. Americans love this stuff. A piece of glossy merchandise that not only looks cute on your coffee table, but that also says cute things when you open it up. Do you think Herman was thinking about all this when he wrote that little book? Of course he was. So all I'm saying here is that what Herman wrote in his journals is nothing more and nothing less than one guy's attempt at recording the good and important stuff about the world he's living in. I kind of mumbled that. So all I'm saying here is that what Herman wrote in his journals is nothing more or less than one guy's attempts at recording the good and important stuff about the world he's living in. Most of all, he's trying to tell his readers a little about life. A little about how life is always better when you pay attention. Most of all, he's trying to tell his readers a little about how life is always better when you pay closer attention to things. His journals are not another advice book, but I'll tell you there's more good advice in them, inferred and otherwise, than there ever was in one of those lightweight bestsellers. I know if I never got all this stuff about Herman off my chest, I'd probably die of congestive heart failure. He always encouraged me to write something in my own words, my own interpretation of things. But I've known for a long time that I don't have it in me to make sense of everything he said, let alone all the stuff in my own life, which, if it made any sense to me, probably came from him in the first place. I could never dream of being the wise man that Herman was. If I could be, I'd write my own goddamn journal, then get Herman to write the introduction to me. That's probably the point of all this. That's probably the point of this entire exercise. While he did force me to feel better about myself, he also helped me realize my limitations. I have only me. I warned you before that my first Herman introduction was written in a bit of a fit. And here's my last bit of advice. If you really want to challenge yourself, try writing something about your best friend or your best teacher, the coolest but most intimidating person you know. Something for the whole world to read. It's educational. If you're anything like me, I can promise that Herman's journals will be a refreshing change from a lot of what you've been reading. I'm sick of all those so-called voices of our generation. I'm sick of all the imposters that somehow get passed off as representative of the rest of us. They're definitely representative of something. They're definitely representative of something, but none of them even come close to the shining example that Herman was. These voices of our generation. Maybe I'm biased. Maybe I am the person who knew him best. I might not be a literary genius, but the fact of the matter is that I know more about Herman than anyone else in the world. Just consider me the biographer of a famous person who isn't famous yet. Herman's rock song of myself from the middle section of his journals is like a storm hovering over the Pacific, just waiting, gathering moisture, building up strength for its inevitable sweep across the continent. For its inevitable sweep across the continent. So here it is. Like I said it was going to be. This is the first thing I wrote about Herman when he told me he was going to write his autobiography. And yes, as it turned out, he did no such thing. Here I was trying to make sense out of life and the world and all the things Herman America said about them. Do you remember ever being called a spaz? Well, a little secret about me. I remember that pretty clearly. Herman once said there's a good chance his story wouldn't be brief. It isn't decided yet, he says, but he'll know when he's done. He said he thought it might go on indefinitely. Indefinitely. I told him he's got problems if he wants to spend his whole life writing. Writing is the opposite of doing. And if he never does anything except write, we all know he'll definitely go crazy. I reminded him once that if he's going to write his entire life, he's going to need material. And he can't get material if he's constantly doing this. This might be the best advice I ever gave him. And now we're on to my original introduction of Herman. And it starts like this. My friend Herman said he's writing his life story and he needs me to help him find readers. That's how it starts.